Do you want me to wait 2 minutes?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for being here, everyone. Really grateful to see you here in person and virtually and other mediums. God's here with us and our ancestors are as well. And I want to begin by acknowledging the land that we stand on, which was once a traditional territory of the Susquehanna people. I also, before we jump into a pretty, I would say fact and stat-based discussion, want to call out about racial justice. I do want to start though by saying that as a white woman, I fully recognize that I cannot claim true understanding of the lived experiences of racial injustice in the United States especially. However, I believe that it is our collective responsibility to confront these issues head on. Today I want to explore some disturbing parallels between the racial inequities plaguing our healthcare system and justice system. By examining the facts and data, we can shed light on these grave injustices and work towards building a more equitable future for all. To get us started, let's see if that worked. Oh. 1 second, maybe I'll just switch to this. There we go, okay. I want to start by going through a little bit of my background. I think the intersectionalities of my experience and what I'm able to talk about today, my experience and expertise in health equity, and then the intersectionality with a couple things, big events in my life over the last 10 years have really brought me to kind of seeking truth for a lot of disparities. And so what you can see across the top here, I've divided this into about 4 parts of my life, where I've lived, where my family members that I've spent, that I hold near and dear to my heart, my spiritual journey, and education and career. As you can see, my dad is Dr. Robert E. Silly, and my mom is Diane Silly. My brother's not here today, and about the halfway through my life, I met Luke, who's here joining with me today. We have a daughter named Sophia, and my brother has recently married Dr. Marissa Milchak. All of these folks have been incredibly valuable, and over the past 5 years after losing my dad in 2022, we have really joined together more closely in all of our journeys. Lived in a lot of different geographies, which means I've spent time in a lot of different churches. Mostly, my foundational years were spent at the Hershey Free Church here locally, and I accepted Christ around 6 at that time. Gone through some pretty different changes of my understanding of religion and the impact in my life in the past 10 years predominantly. And then in my education and career, one of the things that I'll highlight today is around Crayville Mennonite. That was where I went to middle school and grade school, and I feel that has a really played a big part in me thinking about pacifist-based religion and love for my community. Spent time at Hershey High School, and then I went to Penn State where I studied industrial engineering and also had a concentration in life sciences in case I wanted to end up in the more clinical side of medicine. Then I moved into a life career of consulting. A lot of people would say I don't know what I want to do when I grow up because I continue to consult. I started at Accenture right out of undergrad. I spent about 2 years there focusing on health operations improvement. And then I went to MIT to get my master's in healthcare systems engineering and management. It's systems engineering and management, and we could choose what industry we wanted to focus on. And so I looked at healthcare systems, which really opened my eyes to the connection of the social impact in our healthcare, not just across our providers, our healthcare systems, and our payers, the insurance systems and life sciences, but also all of the social community aspects that influence our healthcare. And I did a little stint at the University of Vermont to get a certificate in food systems to help when I started to explore things outside of your traditional healthcare. I spent about 10 years at Oliver Wyman, where I was really focused on strategy, healthcare strategy. So understanding how data can serve to drive insight-driven decisions. We will talk about a lot of that today, because that's where I spent a lot of my career. I have more recently focused and switched into West Monroe, which is less of a strategy firm and more of a implementation firm, where I guide healthcare executives in making choices about how they can modernize their workforce to bring more diversity to the bedside from an experience standpoint, as well as from a life experience standpoint and a skill standpoint, which is very important when we think about the impact of being treated by those that look like us and how that impacts the outcomes in our healthcare system. And so I have focused predominantly in the last 5 years on workforce, healthcare workforce, and healthcare equity. And so what I just kind of want to highlight before we move on is that when I was around in my middle developing years, I was always been a passionate person. My dad wrote me a letter in these last couple of days that said, your passion and conviction is something to be tended to and acknowledged and adored. So I'm a very passionate person. I put world police here because kind of always has felt like something's wrong, I need to make it right, like when there's an issue. Then I kind of moved more into the growing disparities. I mentioned this before, and wanting a need for transparency. So instead of just saying there are inequities, what is the basis for this? And looking at, and I developed kind of a tagline that I would use saying, non-scientifically based variation in access and outcomes. So instead of bringing up the more emotional side of health equity when I talk to health executives, there's a lot of, I think, shame that comes along with that. I tried to break it down to numbers. So where's the non-scientifically based access and outcomes variation that we see in healthcare based on race and other types of differences? And then over the last 4 years, as I mentioned, my dad passed away. We were very close, and I started getting more into a grief ritual. And I wanted to mention that today because I felt that through my grief journey, I learned a lot about self-compassion and how I needed to give myself grace for certain things. And I think that's very important for all of us when we think about health inequity, when we think about racial inequity, when we think about social justice. Not acknowledging our past, whether good or bad, is not going to help us. There is real conviction, there is real redemption in acknowledgement and giving ourselves compassion so that we can work together to build a better future. So that's just a little bit about me before we jump into the main topic at hand and where I've spent quite a bit of time studying, and that's around health equity. So before we get started in this area, I just want to kind of put around the definition before we get into the fact-based definition. Is World Health Organization says that health equity is achieved when everyone can attain their full potential for health and well-being. More than half of people in developed countries experience barriers to worse health outcomes, and because of the breadth of their impact, this impact has created major macro challenges. This is a global view. We'll take it down today from a global to a more local view. But starting at the global view, macro issues that are driven by barriers to health equity over the last 5 years have impacted social injustice across the world. UK women in most deprived areas live 20 years less on average. In the United States, in Philadelphia, you can walk a block, about 2 blocks, and see the difference in age, average life expectancy of 20 years as well. And also noting social injustice in the US, Hispanic patients are 30 times more likely to die from diabetes. They're diagnosed so much later in their path that they are not able to maintain their health like white Americans. Reduced productivity and GDP. So one thing you'll see a little bit about here is a passion in my career has helped me to kind of figure out how to drive things that sit on an ESG report, which are more around like environmental and social good efforts, to the 10K, which is a for-profit report that most companies have to put out. And so this is an area that you'll see focused on here from a business strategy perspective. There is real productivity impact if we are not giving people access to equitable health care. In the US, it's estimated about $42 billion a year of untapped productivity because people are out of work. And this is, bringing it to racial injustice, this is exacerbated for Black workers, which experience 1.5 times a higher likelihood of losing work because of health inequities. And then on the flip side, not just the profit side, but on the loss side, unnecessary medical spending. Recent reports have said that health disparities equate to almost $100 billion in unnecessary spend per year. That's like showing up the ER when you could be going to an outpatient clinic, but because that outpatient clinic isn't open during the time that you would be able to go. And so when we think about the drivers of this, what led us to this? These disparities not only indicate critical gaps in scientific knowledge for today, but they tell us a little bit about the history and how we got here. So when we look at the left side here, a couple stats that I'll just cut to the chase, basically say, since the beginning of Western medicine, white men have been the default human. And so on the left side, these kind of stats support that. Of all NIH directors, less than 80% have been, or sorry, less than 90% have been female since 1887. Less than 10% of CEO roles in biopharma were held by women. Less than 20% of participants in the genome studies, so the genomic studies that we use to help us make decisions about, are there differences in ways in personalized medicine? Can we figure out how someone's genome can impact the treatment they're going to be? Is almost 80% of it comes from white men. 13% of the global pharmaceutical workforce is Black. That is clearly lower than the world population. And then when we get into the clinical trials, less than 80% of women, or less than 80% of the people involved in, men make up more than 80% of people involved in clinical trials, especially phase 1. So there's a huge mismatch. What I'm trying to show here is the mismatch on the left side and the right side, which is our population. Remember, we just talked about the default human for Western medicine being a white male. By 2040 in the United States, especially, white men will make up less, or around 25%, and by 2050 will make up less than 25% of the United States population. So it is in organizations' best interest to better understand their populations and start making changes against these numbers so they can. I want to make things a little bit more real about what we mean by the impact of having kind of a depletion of knowledge, of having some bias, of having barriers to getting to the hospital. These are kind of what we would lay out as your 4 to 5 main kind of care path stages. And so preventive care, when we look at preventive care, there's quite a bit of unequal access to screenings, not just because they can't make it to appointments, but because they're not offered it. Virtually no physicians recommended genetic testing to Black women in 2021. It just was not offered. In second stage, diagnosis. Disease symptoms often present differently by gender or race. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with a psychological cause for their pain. There is no scientific reason for this. That has been proven today. Treatment options, biased treatment selection. This one we'll go into a little bit later. But Black patients in the United States are 25% less likely to be discharged with anticoagulants when they suffer from AFib. What I forgot to mention is all of these stats are corrected for social measures. So this is not because of people living in a lower socioeconomic status or because they're farther away from certain things. These are actually corrected stats. So we're looking at it across less of social impact, up through the third one. The fourth one here, though, starts getting into social impact. So treatment access. Patients and medical facilities have financial barriers that limit some of the treatments that they have access to. One example is some hospitals don't even have buprenorphine or anything that would help an opioid overdose be available in their emergency room. Lastly, treatment adherence, and this one affects all of us, more predominantly those that are in the lower socioeconomic status of our country. But in the last year, roughly half of United States citizens have abandoned their prescriptions because of cost. So what did we do? We looked into some of the main, in my last about 10 years, I've looked into some of the root causes for those disparities. And we've been able to boil it down to 3 areas. First is limited medical knowledge, which you all saw at the beginning, kind of who's influencing the research that we're doing, who is driving the decisions about the criteria for our clinical trials. Second, bias at the bedside. That sounds pretty obvious, but what's important to note here, and this is where we'll start getting into connections to the justice system, is that while there's obviously bias at the bedside coming from the physician in some cases, there's quite a bit of bias coming from patients as well. because of their lack of trust, because things have not been, the medical system in the United States has not been very transparent about certain studies, and we'll get to that in a minute. And so there's a lot of trauma that we need to figure out how to overcome for our patients to trust us. And then lastly, this is probably the most talked about today, but social barriers, SDOH you might hear, social drivers or social determinants of health. These are barriers that prevent folks from getting to their appointments on time, from having coverage. They might be uninsured or underinsured. And so these are common social and policy-driven factors that you might guess are very related to the justice system that we'll be exploring in a moment. So, kind of before I round out the healthcare side of inequity, just want to put a little call out there to those in the healthcare field. Healthcare stakeholders must rapidly build their understanding of the healthcare needs of more diverse populations to, one, provide the majority of the population today with equitable healthcare, and then also to gain the scientific knowledge required to truly personalize medicine in the future. We're creating our own proxies today, our own biased proxies. And when I talked about earlier, workforce, right? Some of that's not clinicians' fault. They are burned out. They have to see patients in 5 minutes and 15 minutes. And so it's natural for our heads to help us do things more quickly, to create those proxies, to look at someone and say, I can probably guess what's better for them based on the way they look, and I only have 10 minutes, so I'm gonna do my best. But without kind of taking a step back to look at what those individual personal proxies are that we've created, when we take that step back, we learn that there's some grave injustices from those. This is that ESG to 10K example that I mentioned before. I'll just take you through kind of how I've talked with folks in the pharma industry about where they can have impact. And so many pharmaceutical companies, you might imagine, when we're talking about adherence and treatment, have started to really see barriers to health equity as a big impact to their bottom line. And so when I've met with folks to kind of think about what are all the different functions that a pharmaceutical company has, and where do they have influence across limited medical knowledge, bias at the bedside, and social barriers. And then we work with those teams to help increase diversity in clinical trials, increase diversity in marketing and communications, and then figuring out how to measure those. I'll round this example out with this is an example of, I mentioned how diseases present differently based on gender is one example. And so the presentation of ADHD in girls has not been studied at the same level that it's been in boys. Globally, boys and girls are diagnosed with ADHD at varying rates, with boys being diagnosed 2 to 10 times higher than girls. But when you actually look at 18 to 20-year-olds, the presence of the disease massively evens out. And that's because of a study many, many, many years ago that was only based on observing boys and the presence or how the ADHD was prevalent in their behavior. And so I'm definitely not saying that more kids should be medicated. I think that our boys are over-medicated, but I think our girls are under-medicated, and this is an example of where and how pharma is paying attention. All right, so that was the area that I am an expert in and can answer questions at the end of this. I am going to switch over to the parallels with our justice system, and recalling back to the intro that I gave at the beginning, as I was working through kind of the last 5 years of my life and building my grief practice, I went on a couple different adventures. One was a retreat down to Montgomery, Alabama, to visit the museums built by or funded by the Equal Justice Initiative, which is an initiative that is driven by Brian Stevenson. He's a lawyer who represents inmates on death row, and he wrote the book Just Mercy. It's recently come out on video. Definitely recommend it. There's another book by a different author called The People's Hospital, which is kind of like the health system version, and his book on Just Mercy is the justice system version of bringing things to life. I definitely recommend it. So what I'm going to jump in here is a historical race-based barriers and progress in the U.S. and healthcare and justice systems, Most of this comes from my tour, which also I'll mention was a women's tour. Went totally, no one I knew showed up, and it was a tour for white women led by women of color. And so it was meant to kind of take us through the museum, which included the tagline for this museum is from enslavement to mass incarceration. And it's a story of race in the United States. We then also went to the Equal Justice Initiative's lynching memorial, and where we got some up close and personal understandings of the murders that took place after slavery was abolished. And then on the final day, we all walked across the bridge together, the Bloody Sunday Bridge, and went through that experience. So it was a very humbling, and I would say an experience that I would not have done without observing grief and how I need to better understand things that I don't. All right, so we mentioned before that number three impact on healthcare outcomes is the social barriers. There are studies that will show you all over that 50 to 80% of health outcomes are driven by non-health related factors. So this is transportation, funding, housing, different types of social factors, and then the rest, 20 to 50% are affected by the healthcare services and health behaviors. So as we think about that, I'm going to take us through a timeline here. What you see on the slide here is major events since before the founding of our country, but after the first slave legislation was enacted in the United States, starting in the 1600s. The red boxes denote health barriers, and the blue boxes denote justice barriers. And I'm going to try to connect them for you guys here, but then I'll show a video that probably does it better. That definitely does it better than I do. And so, starting with health, across the top, in the 17th and 19th centuries, enslaved black people are subjected to medical experimentation without consent. We're going to go into that a little bit more. Then from the 19th to 20th centuries, black doctors and patients are systemically excluded from research. This has led to, in 2020, the AMA declaring racism a public health issue. So let's get started at the beginning. In 1640, Virginia enacts first laws in the world. I did not know this until I went down to Montgomery. We are the first country in the world to document the difference in the way folks are treated after breaking the law based on their race. This was the first time that this was documented was based off of 3 indentured servants that escaped, and they were all caught together, 2 white, 1 black. The 2 white indentured servants that escaped and were caught were able to repay their debts with a couple more years of service. The black man, though, was not able to get out of indentured servitude, and he is the first slave in the United States that is known. And so then moving into Virginia, and this is really when we start codifying after the abolishment of this, or the idea that the slave trade is not humane. We start building our slave trade, that wasn't until 1808, but we start building our slave trade inside of what is now known as the United States. And we've codified a system for kind of the first racial-driven chattel slavery. This is important. As soon as we've codified that system, then we started what's the first version of the police in the United States, the slave patrol. And so the reason I mention all of those is because there is clearly a systemic, pervasive belief across the United States that black people should be treated different than white people in many manners. And we see that in healthcare. One of the most, I think, egregiously overlooked for many years is in 1846 to 1849, when the father of American gynecology conducted almost all of his gynecological experiments that led to his discoveries on enslaved black women without anesthesia. There were 3 that he worked with and through in front of many people conducting his experiments. The Tuskegee syphilis study by the U.S. public health systems invoked nearly 400 black men with syphilis that were deliberately denied treatment because the United States Public Health Service wanted to understand the natural history of syphilis without it being treated. These folks were given fake treatments. They thought they were being treated. This then takes us into the 40s, 1940s, with radiation experiments funded by the US government that were exposed to a disproportionate number of Black individuals, particularly those in the government and incarcerated, and those also who were getting health care at institutions that were not kind of up to code. So what I said, those three examples are pretty damning. I think it's important that we see before those three examples, the 13th Amendment was established before the two of those three, in the middle of one, where slavery was abolished, except for convicts. And so the 13th Amendment really is when we start to also see the United States police, local municipalities, starting to establish police departments that weren't slave patrol anymore, but to enforce Jim Crow laws. At the end of the 1800s, I think it's 87% of the revenue coming out of Alabama was from renting incarcerated labor. So that's right after Plessy and Ferguson upholds the racial segregation, separate but equal law. Lastly, I just want to call out that while in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, in 2010, we noticed, since 2010 and beyond, we've noticed three, and there's plenty more, many US medical protocols that include non-scientifically based race injections into the calculation for receiving treatment. These have been turned around since. There are still many today, and when you hear organizations saying they're putting money towards health equity, this is a big part of that, where they're reviewing their policies to make sure that they don't have race-based influences on their calculations. Kidney failure diagnosis is one area. Vaginal birth after C-section is a huge area. There's a calculation that all women have after they give birth from a C-section to see if it's safe for them to give birth after the vaginal birth, or naturally after they have their C-section on their second or third child. For very long, until 2021, Black women had a higher score assigned to them, which just because of their race, that put them out of the range, acceptable range, to have a VBAC. Black women today have a 3 times higher likelihood of dying in childbirth in the United States than white women. That's up to 8 times as high in the South. Lastly, this one, I think, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this, but in the NFL, they just settled a lawsuit also in 2021 because their traumatic brain injury testing was race normed. And so they were paying out the NFL was paying out for traumatic brain injuries, injuries to its football players. However, someone noticed that way less Black people were getting paid than white people, even though there's a lot more Black people in the NFL. And that was because, based on the rule that Black people are less intelligent, they require more harm to be paid out. They just changed this in 2021. Lastly, I think another fact here I'll call before I turn it over to the experts is that Alabama legally allowed interracial marriage in 2000. So, when folks say that's how it was back then, not in other countries, that's how it was back then, not for very long. It's not back then, it's today. And it takes us realizing it and having compassion for ourselves and for others to really look at these numbers and say these are not scientifically based, and we can do better than that. I'm gonna play a video for you guys that is a better overview of what I saw the...
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end, it simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
So, we're gonna pivot to something a little bit more uplifting, and that is current and local progress overcoming these barriers. And so, starting with the health side, I wanted to give you guys some examples of things that I've either personally been involved with or know that is happening within Pennsylvania. The three examples here are, starting from the left side, is removing health equity barriers in Pennsylvania. Some of you may remember back in 2020, Governor Wolf put an executive order out to address racial inequities in healthcare. And me and a team worked with his office to help identify where are the greatest inequities for different races occurring. And so we led a pretty analytically charged identification process where we met with 5 different groups representing 5 different areas of Pennsylvania: Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, and the Lehigh Capital region, to look at the zip code level. What was the difference in outcomes and access by race? And then we worked with leaders from all Medicaid, managed Medicaid organizations, or any hospitals that take Medicaid funds, which is all, as the governor directed, to identify these areas, do root cause assessments on what's leading to these disparities, and then connect these managed care organizations with the health systems and local organizations in the area. It was a no budget effort, so the only thing we were able to do was kind of say, here's where the root causes are. You've already got a lot of community organizations that can support you. You got to open up your discussion and figure out how to be more coordinated. And that's working today. They're still kind of rolling things out, but this is something that's close to home and from a statewide perspective. Then moving to the middle here, Beacon Clinic, which is serving Cumberland, Dauphin, and Perry counties, is a free faith-based clinic that's providing primary healthcare services to anyone, regardless of their race, religion, nationality, gender, age, sexuality, education, disability, cultural, or immigrant status. They work collaboratively with public and private partners to facilitate the development and provision of primary healthcare services. And today, just gonna call out that we do have the president of their board, Judy Dillon, visiting with us. And I've really been taken by this organization as of late, and I'm excited to get more involved with it. I think this is exactly what's required to help address these barriers and create more connectivity with our health systems and our community organizations. And then lastly, here at Derry, we have a faith community nurse program, Becky, as many of you know. She provides holistic wellness by visiting our church members, connecting the idea of physical health and mental health and spiritual health, assisting congregation members in identifying their health needs, not providing hands-on care, but talking to someone, helping them increase their health literacy, helping them know who to go to in the church. We have many physicians and clinicians in this church, but it's kind of hard to know where to get started. She coordinates health education classes based off of the needs of our congregation. She coordinates health screenings and develops support groups based on what we learn about our congregation. And then I would like to show, to end today, is one more video. It's a little shorter, but this is an example of racial justice and making progress through that. Another video from EJI. And then following that, we will break for questions.
My great-great-grandfather, Anthony Crawford, had an altercation at a store with a white storekeeper about the price of his cottonseed. Grandpa refused to do business with him and was arrested, and then was lynched in a spectacle, ritualistic killing at the town square in Abbeville, South Carolina, 100 years ago.
CLA, Abbeville, Greenwood, 92.9 FM.
A lot of people don't talk about the lynchings in their family, and some of us do. For those of us who do, we represent a whole slew of people who are so traumatized that they can't speak, that their relatives did not pass down this history to them. So the Crawfords have always felt, I think, an obligation to speak up for Grandpa Crawford. We were all socialized that way.
No more of this. This violence must cease. No more of this. No more hanging. No more of this.
Terrorizing the black community, white mobs lynched more than 4,000 black people. 4,000 black people. 4,000 black people in the South between 1877 and 1950, and more than 180 of them were killed in South Carolina. As you witness the bringing of these vessels of soil for holy consecration, may you declare yourself a repairer of the breach, an instrument of reparatory justice that declares never again we are standing on holy ground.
It was moving to stick our hands in that dirt and to look at actual soil that holds many families, too many people's DNA. I think it's a powerful way of symbolizing the history of lynching in the United States.
And if we start telling the truth about our history, we can actually change the climate for freedom in this country. I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. And it turned into decades of terrorism. We're here today because there was terror in this region. Black people were pulled out of their homes, they were burned alive, they were murdered, they were hung, they were beat, they were shot. And that terror has to be acknowledged.
Exactly.
Yes.
This landscape was littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. It is a false story, it is an incomplete story. We're changing that today. And we have to change it because something important happened here. 100 years ago, a man named Anthony Crawford, a strong man, a faithful man, but because he insisted on fairness, a lot of people didn't like that he was doing well. So they didn't like that he could sell food and cotton to white merchants. And one day when he was being confronted by someone who wanted to buy his product for less than was fair, they actually arrested him because they couldn't allow a proud, strong, prosperous black man to stand up for fairness. And that wasn't enough. A mob of 300 people came to the jail to pull him out. A trial wasn't going to be good enough. And they took this man out of the jail, and they actually dragged his body through this community. And then they took him to a spot, and they weren't content to just beat him. They weren't content to just hang him. They shot his body 200 times. When the family, the grieving family whose descendants are here today, just wanted to reclaim their grandfather, the people in control said, no, we're going to let that body hang there for a few days, just as a statement to all the black people in this region. And that family had to flee, and it was an injury. It was a burden. It was an assault. And today we are here to give voice to that hardship. But more than that, we are here to give witness to the importance of what can happen when we come together and say, I'm here. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do to be truth tellers, to be witnesses for justice, is to gather in a place like this and say, I'm here. This marker is a story about hardship, is a story about bruising and cutting and suffering. suffering, but when we get together, when we say we are here, when we join together in truth telling, we turn those cuts, those bruises, those scars into medals of honor. This is the most honorable place in Abbeville, South Carolina.
We were banished. We were ordered out of town. To stand there when everybody was gathered, and I can look out in that crowd and think about how many people got in their cars, how many people got on airplanes, to stand at that moment with the Crawford family as we pulled the cover off of history. America is a place where symbols are important, where markers are important.
And that's a beautiful thing.
When you read that text on that marker, it's the truth. And so where he died in an extra-legal murder, we have come back with an answer to that that's permanent. That's a permanent marker. If you go do business in City Hall, if you go do business at the courthouse, you walk right past Anthony Crawford. And he's looking back at you.
Thank you all for listening.
From
And-
Grandpa to Emmett to Trayvon,
That kept going.
the trajectory of lynching.
There's more videos. Y'all want to check them out at uji.org. Thank you all for listening and being here, right? Acknowledging is important. I thought this video at the end was super important to show because, and through my own personal journey with whiteness, this is what I'm about to say, I think is a pretty great statement. Why would anyone want to celebrate and observe that someone was lynched? I think that's very easy for us to say. Because it's truth. And it's powerful to speak truth. And we have to for us to help our neighbors and for us to help achieve racial justice across so many systems in this country, we have to be honest with ourselves. And it takes self-compassion to do that. And it takes compassion for others who aren't as far along in that journey. But I'm really, really thankful for all of you that are here listening. That's the first step, and maybe you're way more steps into their journey than that, but this is where it starts. So with that, I will end and open for questions. Yes.
The final video we watched, was that, so I know I have not been to the museum in Alabama, but I know that if you go, there is, like, they have options of, and I'm not gonna get this quite right, but they have that have not been put up yet, memorials for those 4,000 people who have
Yeah.
been lynched, and if you live nearby, like, making contact with people of bringing that
Yeah,
back to them.
thanks for bringing that up.
Was
It's
one
a
of
really,
those?
yeah, let me tell you a little story about it.
Okay.
So for those that couldn't hear, the question was just around kind of where in the memorials in Alabama, like what's kind of the story behind the dirt that we saw, and then the connection to the lynching memorial that they also have there. Did I get that
Yes.
right? Okay. So at the museum, that's the Peace and Justice Museum, they do have over 800 jars of dirt that they have collected, and that is an effort that the EJI will help you. If anyone here wants to take that on and support, please do it with people of color who have experienced this and want to work with us or you on it. But they have sort of resources for you to find out how to honor victims that were murdered through lynching. And that the person you just saw there was one of the first people, where they went to the area that he was lynched and collected the dirt and put it in the container, and all of those are at the EJI. Now, when you do that and you saw the plaque that was put in to memorialize, at the museum in Montgomery, they have replicas of every single plaque, so that we can know who has done it and where you can go see that. And so you can work with, the EJI has set up a ton of resources based on state to like kind of get more involved with helping to honor that history. Did that answer?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Separately, there is a lynching memorial, which does not contain the soil, but actually contains more of a view of, it looks like coffins hanging, honestly. And it has the names of everyone by state and year that were lynched and the reason, when they know it. The reasons are pretty terrible.
But because I know the hope is, because there's sort of that centralized memorial, but you know, you're not in that space all of the time, and the hope is to make more places where you're noticing it, you're aware of it, to make people more conscious of that history on like a regular basis.
I would think making
not
people
just
aware of
lost.
it with the statues and those pieces I would say that's probably a secondary goal.
Yeah.
I think the first goal is to really acknowledge the harm to families and their generations after that, and be there with them. And then there's probably a snowball effect as you do more and more of that. And yesterday I went on the tour with many of you in the room about Indigenous people in central Pennsylvania and the Presbyterian and kind of Mennonite, different dynamics with those populations. And so honoring land from Native Americans is also a step that you can take outside of kind of the racial justice support. There's also Native American support and observing who was on the land before, and creating more awareness around that is another way to, it's not just enslaved. Remember, we brought enslaved people here to replace the other people that were here that we took the land from. Yes?
I have a question. Back to the beginning of your conversation, you had an interesting chart based on a whole lot of factors. The question I have is, how would those factors change if you took the hospital's profit motive out?
Huge.
I mean, it's everything that you said is based on how much money a hospital is making at this instant, and that's what drives everything. And if you take that out and go to the nonprofit, where you treat somebody simply because they're there, that has to skew your chart just out of proportion. And I think that's an important factor to make, particularly if you have Big Pharma, because Big Pharma is driving everything that we do and say, because about half the commercials seem to be a pharmacy, Big Pharma selling you something to make you feel good, get better, whatever.
Right.
It's a perpetual scheme that we found to make more money for a few big companies.
Yeah, and we're the only country that allows those advertisements. So the question was, is this data skewed because of the for-profit nature of our health industry? Not all are for-profit, obviously. I would say that it exacerbates it for sure, but we can't ignore it,
No.
right? Because we're living in it. But if you did look across at other countries that have more of a socialized medicine aspect, you wouldn't not see these gaps. They just would not be, they're not nearly as big. But I did start with the stat about how, we still do have women or Black women that are in poor situations live 20 years less, live 20 years less than someone who might be more well off. And so it plagues kind of the world nationally, but in the United States it's exacerbated for sure by by our drive for profit, or no margin without mission, or no mission without margin.
And I think another thing you did not address is the impact of the current tolerance or intolerance of healthcare for women.
Mm-hmm.
And that's becoming
Should I make that my next
exacerbated.
presentation? This one's race, I'll do gender next time. You wanna do it?
That's becoming where, if I were a young woman of childbearing age, I'm not sure what I would do. Probably move to Canada or England. I mean, it's scary when you see what's happening throughout our, and it's about half the states right now, with a bunch more
Yep.
on this step.
Right, and
It's
so-
scary.
It's super scary, and to tie that, so for folks that didn't hear, it was a question about what about the gender disparities in our healthcare system in the United States. They're massive, right? So these are actually contributing more to that, the gender disparity here, and the clinical trials. They are exacerbated by our racial injustice. So to what you're talking about, women's reproductive health. If we are taking away the access to abortions, when we look at Black women who are dying 3 times higher likelihood than white women, and then you're forcing birth, I mean, that's like the compounding nature there is a death sentence for so many people. And so you're right on. I would be happy to come back and do the gender review. I also have studied that. And that's actually where I started. I started looking at the differences between men and women in healthcare. And then over the last couple years is when I really, COVID, started bringing the data out more so on the race side. But you're right on. And my husband and I have a 4-year-old girl. We talk about all the time. Do we want to move? Right? Do we want her growing up here?
Yeah, where do you want to move?
Great question. Yes.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the Beacon Clinic. The church supports a clinic at 13th and Derry. And I'm just wondering, is that connected in any way, or how does that work?
Judy, can you take this?
Sure, I'm happy to. So yeah, the clinic on 13th is a wonderful clinic. It's now connected with Holy Spirit, which is Penn State Health. They're doing great work in that pocket of the community. We are down on Seneca, so we are another similar, but we are totally separate. But our guidelines for seeing all patients that don't have insurance, our eligibility is very similar to what Vanessa does, Garcia, who's the executive director there. So we're both working together very hard to improve the care of that population in Harrisburg. So we're very close partners working together, but we're totally separate.
We also support Hope Within.
Yes, yeah, it's another excellent one. Absolutely.
Wonderful. That's great. I should have mentioned that. Next time. Again, thank you all so much. I think we're going to go off from the camera here. Thanks to those that joined here. Happy to discuss more anytime. My name is Elizabeth Southerlan. I am a member and elder here at the church, so I'm here on Sundays.
Thank you.
Thank you.